Imagine when you are in a class. In a classroom, a professor is teaching a class, and a group of students are working very hard. Suddenly, there's a person looking like a staff from the university. The person says, "You cannot use this classroom. Please prepare to leave." What is your reaction? And imagine if this information does not come from the staff. Imagine the information is announced by a robot. What will be your reaction? Actually, this is a little test done by a Japanese researcher. The Japanese researcher designed and built a robot. And he did a little test on how people trust the information given by the robot. So, he asked the robot, well, I should say, he designed a robot to enter a room where the professor is teaching and discussing with other researchers, students, about some research. And the robot said, this room has been booked by some other purposes. You have to prepare. You have to use another room. What is the reaction of that Japanese group? And the Japanese researcher actually did a similar test, but this time, not to a Japanese group. This time, he did the same thing to an American group, where American researchers, American professors, American graduate students are working together, discussing research. Yes, the reaction from the two groups. Similar? Different? Okay, let me tell you. The Japanese group reacted immediately. The first reaction of the Japanese group was they started to leave. They tried to pack things and bring things like computers, like data, like books, like their notes, and prepare and to move to another room, which means they trusted the technology. They trusted the information given by the robot. How about the American group? The American group was very suspicious. The American group didn't react like the Japanese group. They did not prepare to leave. They questioned the information. And some even said, the machine must be broken, or this must be a joke. Let's continue. Someone get the robot out of the room. Let's continue. That story was not a real lab experiment. That test was not very well controlled. But from the story, but from a little test, we could somehow find out some kind of differences on trust of technology. Here I'd like to continue to introduce the one very important culture theory, which is self-control. And this concept is very similar to the individualism theory we have introduced. And the concept is very similar to the dimension of individualism in culture theories. There are basically two kinds of self-control. One kind is independent self-control. And the second kind is interdependent self-control. From the figure, you could see how individuals have been identified in the group or even defined by themselves, by the groups. So independent self-control people, they tend to identify themselves as individuals. But interdependent self-control people identify themselves more like someone in the group, just like how they describe themselves as, they refer themselves as we, or I, or you, or you group. And we use the example in the Chinese language, in Korean and in Japanese. The Chinese is 学长 or 学姐. And in Korean, is sanbei. In Japanese, senpai. Similar meaning. The meaning of the three terms are very relevant to the concept of interdependence. And people do not just identify themselves in a group. Further, we found out people even identify machines in group or out group, like independent self-control or interdependent self-control. When a smart machine was an in-group member, one research has found Chinese people in that experiment feel more comfortable. And Americans in that experiment did not feel that comfortable with the group. And American did not feel that comfortable with the smart machine. It's just a machine. But we find out people may trust, people may favor in-group smart machine, or people may have bias on out-group members, including people in smart machines. When we say smart machines, meaning hardware, software system with higher intelligence. And when we say higher intelligence, we actually mean communication styles. And how do we identify a smart machine as in-group or out-group? Not just by experience. When we say machine, we know machine is a machine. We perceive a smart machine, a smart technology, based on how they communicate with us. Voice recognition function and voice audio agent has been used in smart devices like mobile phone and our personal computers. And they talk to us, they communicate with us like our people. At least they try to. At least we try to design a system to talk to people naturally. So with your smartphone, you can ask some question without typing, just speaking. You can just say your question. Please find this for me. I want to know this. Please search for me. And the machine and the smart system can communicate with users in a different way. Here's another theory is quite related. It's how people communicate depend on context. We find out there's some people, there's some culture. Some people prefer to communicate depending on context. Some other cultures, some people prefer to communicate depending on logic. They're different style. And high context people may give implicit code in communication. They may say things indirectly. But low context people, they may be very direct. You don't find that much ambiguity in the communication. But to the opposite, high context cultures prefer indirect communication. It could be ambiguous. And information and communication really depends on context, depending on who the people are, depending on the environment, depending on the tasks, so on and so forth. There are many issues related. I give you my personal experience. Because of my research, I travel a lot and I have chance to teach and to work with people from different countries. I remember when I was in Japan, I saw Japanese professors communicate with their students. In that case, I remember the Japanese professors was very, very nice and provided a lot of information. And even with my limited Japanese language, I thought the student has done a great job. His report was very excellent. After the conversation, I tried to communicate with the student and the professors. I find out the student's work wasn't really so excellent considered by the professor, but I couldn't really tell. I find out some indirect communication styles in that conversation. Very simple example. The professor didn't say, oh, this is not so good, this is not, there's a better way. He didn't really say that. He just did this. Watch me. He didn't even say something. Just by this very simple body language, somehow the student knew professor didn't really agree with that point of view. The professor had some different ideas. The professor didn't really have to say it. Just by showing this posture, the student understood, which could be very difficult for us to communicate, right? But similar situation, when I tried to communicate it with my Chinese student, I did a little test. I found out my Chinese student thought the research, the report, was very excellent. So the communication style really depends on culture. And let's talk back about smart machine. Smart machine can communicate with people by natural language, not programming language. And the output, the feedback from the smart machine, the smart device, also can be in natural language. The machine can be very direct, or try not to be so direct, because sometimes in some cultures, if you say no directly, it could be very impolite or very rude. So in some cultures, they prefer indirect communication styles, even communicating with smart machines.